Well, it's about 12. I think we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Erin Kelly. I'm the Executive Director of Preservation Massachusetts, and I want to welcome you to Preservation Conversations. Since 2020, these conversations have provided an opportunity for learning and discussing certain preservation topics. If this is your first time joining us, we have just a few housekeeping items before we get started. We ask that you please keep yourself muted at all times to cut down on noise and also distractions to our speakers. If you have questions or comments, please use the chat feature, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation with the time that we have today. And please be advised that this presentation is being recorded and will be posted to Preservation Mass's YouTube account and our website. If you prefer not to be visible, please turn your camera off. Now, today, we are very pleased to be joined by Craig Della Penna for the Railroad Ties That Bind, the Central Mass Rail Trail and Norwottuck Network. Within 150 miles of Northampton lies the densest network of former steam railroad corridors in the United States. The longest, most complex of these corridors in New England is the Mass Central Rail Trail, which runs 104 miles from North Station in Boston to Union Station in Northampton. Craig is the board president of Norwottuck Network, a 20-plus-year-old nonprofit. Today, the network is working to reassemble the former railroad corridor from Northampton all the way to Boston, converting the ex-Boston and Maine Railroad's Mass Central branch, into the longest rail trail in New England. He's given over 1,200 lectures in 21 states on various topics related to the conversion of former railroads into linear parks, including a presentation at our own 2021 statewide preservation conference. He is the author of 5 books, the forewords to several more, op-eds in numerous newspapers, and in the past few years, 5 books have been written that feature him in their case studies in various realms, including 2 about his innovative real estate practice. He and his wife, Kathleen, also operate a bed and breakfast that sits 8 feet from the rail trail in Northampton's historic Civil War-era industrial village of Florence. So, Craig, I think we're all very excited for this presentation today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Erin. Looking forward to this talk for a long time. This is, we're right on the cusp of something very big happening here. And I'll talk about what's going on and what's about to happen here. And so thank you for hosting me today. Let's see here. So Preservation Mass, here we are. This is I guess it's a monthly series of preservation conversations. And here's my real estate office in downtown Florence and my old British sports car. I live and breathe old things. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. This is a 40-year journey to create the longest rail trail in New England, from Boston to Northampton, 104 miles long. The claim to fame for this line was that when Calvin Coolidge was the governor, he rode this as a commuter rail train every day from Northampton to Boston. But I'm going to connect the dots for you today. You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them by looking backwards, said Steve Jobs. And I've been doing this work in the background here for probably over 25 years. And I'm sort of like the annoying Rain Man of rail trails, but I'm also like Forrest Gump. I'm a witness to iconic events that you really never really know what they're about until you just kind of look at the big picture and see how they all connect together. And I'm going to connect the dots for you here today. I'm going to talk about the 40-year journey here to get this corridor reassembled, the disappointing years, the regroup and recover years, the tipping point years, and the breakthrough. Here's how the idea of a 104-mile-long trail came to be. It is this section here. This is the 3rd east-west route across the state. Just below my rectangle here, you see the very thin, not bold line. That's the old New York Central, now CSX line that goes across the state. About 80% of the traffic coming into Massachusetts traverses on that east-west corridor. The Mass Central line's been segmented since the Great Hurricane of '38. And then the top line here, about 20% of the traffic comes through that line. That's the B&M. Now it's owned by CSX again here. So I think it'll be diminished further in the coming years. But in 1980, the State Parks Agency bought the westernmost 8.5 miles of the corridor and began a 13-year process to develop and build out the trail as it's known today as the Norwottuck Rail Trail. And yes, took 13 years after they bought it. Takes a long time to build trails in Massachusetts. In 1988, there was a family that lived in Central Mass. They actually traveled out to Northampton and then walked to North Station in Boston over a period of days. And they wrote a never published manuscript. It was given to one of the top officials at DEM, Department of Environmental Management in that era. And he gave me a copy of it when I met up with him in the 90s. And I actually looked for this family and I found them. And what they did is very interesting. It's an antique topo map. And on the facing page is a little narrative of what they found along the way. But they never published it. And I met up with one of the sons. I think the father has passed away now. And I think maybe we're going to be able to publish this as maybe as a coffee table book and integrate in with contemporary photos of these eras today, these areas. But that's a subject for another time. In 1993, the Norwottuck Rail Trail opened, and it was a great success, well loved. And around a couple of years later, the Wachusett Greenways was formed in the center of the state, and they purposely built out their section as a soft surface stone dust trail, not a paved trail. All the rail trail wars that took place in Massachusetts in the 90s, which there were about 8 to 10 of them, where the trail was actually voted down, largely because of the idea of paving the local dead railroad, and people didn't want it paved. And in Massachusetts, you had no choice but to pave. It had to be paved, except if you funded it through environmental sourced monies. If you were going to fund it through transportation monies, then it had to be paved. Wachusett Greenways did it quietly, no drama, no wars. They built it out, volunteer-based projects, small pots of money, a couple of 100 yards one year, maybe a half mile another year. Here we are years later, and they're mostly done. In 1995, also, the sixth community wayside trail in the Metro West area of Boston and the Belchertown Rail Trail began both to be talked about. The disappointing years. Both Belchertown was voted down, and the western portion of the Wayside Rail Trail was voted down. And when Weston voted it down, the Wayside Trail fell dormant. The idea of a trail fell dormant. And there was actually the Weston, let's call it a little war, was a nationally known phenomenon. In fact, in 1998, a year after the votes, they were both in the same week, actually, Commonwealth Magazine did a story about the to-do in both Belchertown and Weston. And by the way, all the links I'm giving on here, those will be hot links that you can see, because I have oodles of information. I'm writing a memoir that'll curl people's hair about what happened here in the last 40 years. The other things, there was maybe even the Los Angeles Times. This was a big story. And in Weston, the lead opponent was a operative lobbyist employee of the American Farm Bureau. And back then, not so much now, but back then, American Farm Bureau was a leader in fighting rail trails. It was easy for him to take the lead on this. And though the other communities in the Wayside area were supportive, the idea went dormant for almost 10 years. But it was national news that Weston voted it down. And there's more links here to other stories from the era. The Regroup and Recover years. In 1999, the Department of Environmental Management released a report that called for more trail projects encouraged piecing together the Mass Central Rail Trail. This was the first time that those 4 wards were seen in a state document. The original name of the railroad was Mass Central Railroad, but then it went bankrupt early on, and a bankruptcy court renamed it the Central Mass Railroad, which doomed it to failure. If you can just envision the New York Central Railroad being renamed as the Central New York Railroad, you knew that there was nothing but doom ahead. But Mass Central Rail Trail was a newfangled idea, and the link here to that booklet, and it's very, very, looking back at it now, 24 years later, it's really, really telling. And it says here, given the length of the proposed cross-state trail and the complexity of issues surrounding the funding of such an endeavor, it is critical to remain focused and to provide support and encouragement for many organizations along the way. And so it goes on and on. This is important to do. So funding for anything that says it's part of the Mass Central Rail Trail gets funded in little pieces here and there. And here is Congressman McGovern 24 years ago with Colleen Abrams, president of the Wachusett Greenways, talking about one of these openings that they had, one of their small local driven projects. And in 2002, we held our second, I think it was the second event was in 2002. We had 400 people in Waltham. Gubernatorial candidates were there. It was a big event. We hold Golden Spike events every few years. We have another one coming up in Natick, coming in mid-October this year. How the Norwottuck Network came to be was back in the later days of the Clinton administration, when the Federal Highway Administration suggested to all states they hold a contest to see what trail could be chosen as the best trail in the given state. And the Norwottuck Network, which was just a little thing proposed by a couple of professors at the University of Massachusetts, they didn't expect to win, but they did. And so what does that mean? Well, they had to form a 501c3 to get the $10,000 gift from American Express. And they did, and they became a little background organization doing good little betterments for the trail network in the western region of this corridor. And they did a lot of good work over the years, but it was they were largely unknown. And we now have a new logo. They asked me to come on in 2019. They were going to retire and turn in the 501c3. I said, no, I'll come back on board as the executive director, and we will envision the mission statement to be bigger, grander, the entire corridor, not just the last 10 miles. And we will do something here that's very special. We'll bring on people on our board that are along the entire corridor. And so in 1999, going back in time again, the state Senate's Post-Audit and Oversight Committee came to the Wachusett Greenway section of West Boylston. They brought staffers from the Office of Disabilities to tour a stone dust section. And as I noted before, Massachusetts is the only state in 50 to require paving. Well, these people here, some of them in wheelchairs, were so impressed by the trail that they wrote a letter to DOT and said, a stone dust trail is fine. You should do this. You're the only outlier state in 50. You can't be outlier on this issue. You have to fold in. And so Mass DOT eventually did. And it was, it's now possible to do this. And here is the map, chapter 11 of the Mass DOT Design Guidebook. It describes how soft surface trails are now permittable. And going ahead now to Belchertown. When the Belchertown Rail Trail War took place in the late 80s, one of my battle-hardened veterans didn't go crying away. He went to the railroad and bought 2.5 miles for the paltry sum of $100,000 back then. And he went to local land trusts to sell it to them to help get the trail project going forward. Because when the trail was voted down, part of the complications was the town didn't own a single inch of it, 0 miles. And so this fellow went to buy it, shop it to land trusts. And this was kind of a newfangled idea for land trusts. Most land trusts in Massachusetts today are still rectangular thinking land trusts, let's say, but there are a few that are linear thinking land trusts. But the Belchertown Land Trust was formed because they couldn't find a conventional land trust that was interested. So Belchertown Land Trust was the first linear thinking land trust in New England to step up and do this, and they quietly, without any drama, reassembled the corridor over years. Central Highlands Conservancy was one thing I formed back in 2005 to parts of this corridor were always under threat of being sold. There's a process unbeknownst to most people in Massachusetts that you can buy a dead railroad, and if it's your intention is to block the trail, well, step right up. The state would ostensibly have a role in defending it, but most times they did not. So here I bought 3.2 miles, including 3 bridges, and I gave the local land trust, a linear thinking land trust by then, to buy me out, and they did. And they then restored the bridges. This was actually the last of its type still standing in New England. And had we not stepped up to do this, it would have been scrapped out. And so this is these are my 3 bridges I bought. The one on the lower left is actually on the left side is the last of its type. It's called Pony Truss Bridge. In any case, that saved a few miles of corridor. And then in 2006, I was biking across the state with a travel writer from the New York Times and the Boston Globe, and I came upon the theft of the corridor here, where somebody had taken a diamond tip cutoff saw. This is in Berlin, Massachusetts. And they took it, they cut out a section of track, 30-foot section, dragged it out of the way with the ties attached, bulldozed out the berm, and then they created a driveway to put in a house. And so that, I took some pictures of that and I sent it to the MBTA's real estate department, and they then offered a lease to DCR, the State Parks Agency, to prevent this from happening again. And that's how the Wayside Trail project got underway. In 2009, getting closer to today, the state under Governor Deval Patrick, they changed their rec use statutes to include the possibility of railroads or utility corridors making available for recreational uses their lands. And that helped. In fact, National Grid, who's the second largest owner of dead railroad in Massachusetts, they were at the bill signing ceremony. They were in the background helping that law get passed. More behind the scenes stuff. In 2013, Mass DOT, the executive director of DOT, wrote a letter urging that all places in Massachusetts have the opportunity to develop a rail with trail. That would be a trail alongside an active railroad. They were encouraging such projects, and they were going to help ensure that they got built. And so that has helped things get moving forward. I was involved in 3-4 rail trail wars in Eastern Mass in the mid to late teens. And a couple of my battle-hardened veterans were getting a quit, and they said, we're sick of the drama. We want to do something fun, not something stressful. And I said, you can't quit. You just don't know what's going on 2 or 3 towns away. So I hired an assistant. We then produced a e-newsletter. We run a Google search of newspaper stories about rail trails within 150 miles of my house, the densest network of dead steam railroad corridor in North America. And we pump it out there. It goes up to over 15,000 people now. And Constant Contact, who hosts it, they tell us that it's in the top 10% of all their e-newsletters worldwide. people are so enthralled by this. This is the biggest thing that you've never heard of. In 2017 also, Wachusett Greenways opened their 20th mile of their 30-mile section. All quietly done, little tiny grants, doing a couple of 100 yards, a couple of miles here. They had free bridges left over from the big dig construction in Boston. They moved them out to Central Mass to bridge gaps in the trail. Belchertown Land Trust. They donated 5 miles of the corridor, and the town actually got a couple of miles of the corridor too. So they're 2 miles short of owning the whole corridor. This has happened. A Friends group was built in Belchertown. There's an active Friends group. They have a beautiful website. In 2018, when Governor Baker was on board, and he heard about what's happening in New York with the creation of the Empire State Trail, and he realized that there were 4 agencies in Massachusetts that were involved in trail development, but they never talked to each other. So he ordered them to staff a twice-a-month meeting in his suite of offices, not in the silos of the various agencies. And he or Lieutenant Governor Polito would take part in the meetings often. And so that took down most of the silos in Massachusetts, but not all the silos, and there's a couple left to go. But this has helped accelerate things. Weston, who voted down the project, and after the graft was uncovered in Berlin, the DCR got control of the corridor, and Eversource wanted to put an underground, in certain areas, an underground grid, more robust grid in other areas like Weston and Wayland, and they actually helped build out the trail. So it got built in 2019. This is the ribbon cutting. In 2020, did you know that there's a 1,000-foot tunnel on this corridor that is now getting restored? The plan is in place and they're beginning to do it. We're in 2 years. Right now we're at 55 miles open. In 2 years, we'll be 75 miles open. 95 miles are right now in our protected status. That is to say, owned by a state agency, a municipality, or a land trust, a linear thinking land trust. Did you know that there are more land trusts in Massachusetts than anywhere else in the United States, except for California, which is 20 times larger? And we're talking about preservation. Most of the time, as we talk about preservation in the context of preservation mass, we talk about the built environment. Well, land trusts also are a hybrid in some certain circles. They'll go in the built environment that was the dead railroad. That 95% of the work to create the railroad is not the track, but is the shape of the land to make it smooth and grade free. And so we are putting together something here that is unbelievable. During the pandemic, Mass DOT, they realized that they're a visionary organization now. They think ahead, years ahead. They know that we're at 55 miles open now, 2 years, 75 miles. What's going to happen? How are we going to get to 100% built out? Could it even be done? They commissioned a report that showed, yes, a 3-volume granular-based detailed volume series of 3 volumes here. This is doable. It'll be complicated, i.e. jargon for expensive. So they realize it can't be done, but it begs the question, the elephant in the room question: what would it be worth to the Commonwealth and the communities along the way if it was completed? And so they weren't going to take on that task. So here's a task for the Norwottuck Network. By the way, everything I just spoke about here is on a 2-pager infographic. This will curl your hair. You wonder why it takes so long to build things here. We produced during the pandemic last summer. We produced an RFP. This was based on the skeleton of the RFP that convinced the state of New York to build out the Empire State Trail. And this is modeled after the RFP for that. And it asked the question, we're going to find a consultant who can answer this question. what would it mean? We hired a consultant, Kittleson and Associates, along with Cambridge Econometrics. If you haven't heard of the latter one, it's because they're based in Cambridge, England. Though the staff in the United States here are based here in Massachusetts. And the guy, Dan Hodge, he's one of the principals at Cambridge. He's well known in the consulting world to prove that big capital expenditures of public money on capital projects, is that project worth that vast expenditure? And so a lot of the rail resurrection projects in Massachusetts, commuter rail enhancement projects, that's up his alley. So doing an economic impact research on a project that's kind of like a cutting edge thing and not really seen commonly. And so this is what they do. And the report is now complete. In fact, I just sent to governor, lieutenant governor, climate chief, and head of DOT a copy of this report. This report's now online. We're going to be out widely. Right now, it's hardly anybody knows about it, but in a few weeks, it's going to be widely known. This is a view of my beautiful valley here. We're looking south. One of the reasons this is different here, if you didn't know, that mountain range in the background, that's an east-west mountain range. Most mountain ranges in North America run north-south. Here, it runs east-west, puts a different spin on things. The bridge in the foreground here is the Dead Railroad Bridge. And actually, that bridge took 3 financial scandals to get built. It's one of only a handful of it's very rare iron bridge, still standing. It's 1,400 feet long, the longest crossing of the Connecticut River. And we had a fellow who was on our board for many years. Maybe some of you remember, he was active in the historic preservation world, Tom Kelleher. And he is, hi, Catherine, I can't talk right now. I'm in a meeting. I can't talk right now. He passed away last winter, and he is he's remembered for his cartography. He did beautiful maps of all the rail trails in Massachusetts, and we have a new cartographer on board, a young fellow, Danny Nonix from Boston, and this is one of his maps. The green equals open, and it's dark green equals paved, light green equals stone dust, blue equals public ownership, publicly protected, red is closed, either not in public ownership or some defect or just some complications, and the brown is under construction. And you can see the east end of the state here. And it's, this is some of the network that connects in. And actually, let's go back on the left side here, the one going to the south. That is actually the longest interstate trail in the Northeast. That goes from Northampton all the way to New Haven. And so that's probably 90% done. A little higher altitude look. This is what it looks like now. The report by Kittleson really has got some very interesting metrics in here. Within 1 mile of this trail and all the network that directly connect to it are 23% of the state's population. Within 10 miles of the trail is almost 2/3 of the state's population. There is nothing else like this in North America. Tourism is the 3rd largest industry in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is the 6th state for attractiveness and patronage by tourists coming from Europe. And what do European tourists mostly know? They mostly know biking. Wouldn't it be nice to have a way for them to bike across all of Massachusetts and see all these places? Oh my God. Completing the Mass Central Rail Trail will bring 4.4 to 5 million users a year. 900,000 just in Worcester County. 64% of the state's population lives within 10 miles. 400,000 to 500,000 overnight visitors. $200 million in economic impacts a year. This is big. Norwottuck Network. What are we going to do? We're going to once this report comes out, and to do all the interviews with the newspapers and blogs and everything. And hopefully the state will decide to prioritize this and create a plan to get it done in, I don't know, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, but get it done. What are we going to do next? We're going to circle back to our original thing after we remade the Norwottuck Network. We're going to call out historic callouts on a 100-mile trail. This is going to be very big. We're going to do the signage along the trail, kiosks for history. For example, on the left side is a standardized blueprint for DCR kiosk, and we will then fundraise for grants to communities. They can say what they want on the trail about their little locale, their things about the trail that they're pertinent to that place, but we want them to use the colors and fonts and designs of our kiosks, so it becomes it'll become a nationally known resource. Did you know here's a mile marker? This is a little odd mile marker. This one's in kilometers. This is in West Roxbury off of New Haven Avenue. But you never knew that before. This is one of Tom Kelleher's maps. Currently, his estate is tied up in probate court. Hopefully, we'll be able to restore his online resource here and integrate it back into Norwottuck Network. But this is a great resource. He's detailed exactly where and what condition all the mile markers are in. It's like a little spreadsheet. He was very organized and very detailed of all the beautiful mile markers along the way. And you can see the B51 there and N68. N was 68 miles to Northampton, and it was 104 miles to Boston. So 68 minus that, you see it's going to be on the other side there. But we're also going to be doing QR code markers. You've all heard of these. They're very trendy now. They came out around 15-ish years ago, and they didn't come out with a bang. They were kind of a flop, but now they're coming around, and they're very popular today. And what we're going to do, we're going to be working with B&M Railroad Historical Society, Mass Historic, local historic societies at the municipal level. I hope at the Preservation Mass level, because I know that you guys are tied in all around the state. But we want to have QR codes along the way and audio, video links on our website with remembrances by local people talking about a notable place on the corridor. So it'd be the longest and most comprehensive series of QR codes on a rail trail in the United States. And so that is it in a nutshell. I'd be happy to entertain any questions here today. And thank you, Aaron.
Wow, Craig, that was incredible. Thank you so much. I'm just blown away by all the work that you have done and Norwottuck Network has done, and just the sheer determination. I think everybody, anybody who's been involved in any, I wouldn't say just preservation project, but any project related to history, telling stories, it's always, preservation always takes time, and it always takes longer than you think. So to share the story, and I think it was great to highlight that, yes, you have some good years, and then you have disappointing years, and then you have the years where you rebuild and you kind of bounce back. Before I get into, and I again encourage people, if you have questions specifically about the work the Norwottuck Network has done, you want to pick Craig's brain, I'm sure he's happy to share some of his vast expertise on this. Is it possible to get a copy of the presentation you just gave, and we can put it on our website if that's okay with you? We'll obviously make sure there's appropriate credits and everything on there. Okay,
sure.
wonderful.
It's probably pretty large. I can send it through Dropbox or
Okay.
WeTransfer or something like that.
Mm-hmm. That works fine. Great. Thank you so very much. It's very generous of you. You told one of the things that really stuck out for me is something that, at Preservation Mass, and when we're talking with, with local advocates about particular present challenges or projects, it's really about partnerships and collaborating with people that sometimes you don't really envision yourself collaborating with. And that was very evident with a lot of what you were doing. I mean, here you are, a small nonprofit organization, then you're engaged with, DOT and, utility agencies, all sorts of things. So obviously, partnership is very important to the work and to the ultimate success of the different, putting together this whole rail trail, this whole corridor. What would you attribute your, the success, what would you attribute your success to in getting to the point of, being, 50 miles open at this point and as much protected that you have right now? What would you attribute to your success?
I would say it's off the radar screen, small, low key, volunteer organizations, locally driven, not top down, very much locally driven. But now we're at the point of there are gaps to fill, and the gaps are going to be expensive. There are 5 bridges, I think several of them are over 500 feet long. And there's some state agencies, I won't name them today, that are still in their silos, and they actually do things that are damaging to the prospects. When I say damaging, I always take the long-term view of things. They damage them to slow down the project. They cannot stop this. This thing will get built, whether it's in a couple of years or it could be another 25 years, but it will get built. This is inevitable. And these projects, I was involved in all the wars, and I know most of the antis over the years. And they always said to me that they always were afraid of the trail getting built because it was going to devalue their property. And there's a truism that is called the 3 stages of truth. The first stage is people will laugh at your idea and think it's nonsensical. The second stage is people will be virulently opposed and fight to their last breath. The third stage is, oh, who could be opposed to that? And we are in the third stage now. There are people that are, maybe it's just a generational shift on things, but we are in the third stage largely in some places, most places now. So that it's a locally driven project, but now it calls out for leadership to bring it over the finish line, to get it finished. This isn't going to get finished by fundraisers at PTOs. This is going to be big ticket stuff now.
Yeah. I think another thing that was quite clear is just the absolute, the amazing impact and real power that, small, that local advocates and community members can have in a cumulative sense. It does, like you said, a lot of it was, small fundraisers, a couple of yards one year, half a mile the next year. So it does take time, but slowly chipping away at it. And really, sometimes I know I sometimes get the sense or, hear from advocates, well, what can I do? I'm just, we're just a small little group. You can really have a really big impact. And it's so very evident. And I can't wait for your, this report to come out. I'm really, and we're happy to promote it. And with your QR codes, anything we can do at Preservation Mass to help you or, get the word out, just, let us know. We're happy to support you. And another thing that you mentioned a couple of times was, linear thinking, land trusts. And I knew that Massachusetts had more land trusts than communities. I didn't know we had the most in the country, second only to California. That's amazing. But sometimes we do get, siloed, like people think preservation, oh, we're just buildings, or land trust, oh, it's just land. But ultimately we're all after the same thing. So how can we, shift and work together to ultimately achieve, ultimately achieve that same goal. So I think what you've said today brings a lot of validation to smaller groups that, combined, what you're doing really, really does matter. Was there any other inspiration for you aside from the Empire rail trail system in New York? I happened to be watching Jeopardy, I think it was last week, and there was a contestant that works for like a national rail trail group trying to connect the whole country, trying to make one big trail across the United States. And that kind of piqued my interest because I knew we had this conversation coming up. Were there other rail trail groups here in New England or across the country that were inspiring?
I used to market rail freight, and I set up and plan the operations and startup of huge transloading facilities for railroads or wholesalers of various groups. But I have a background in railroad history, and I was put under contract to write a series of books about old rail lines and their history as they were being converted to linear parks. And there was a fellow buying my books by the case in Eastern Mass and giving them away at trailheads. And he'd say, this isn't just a cute path in the woods, this is an important place that made our community wealthy. This old railroad has a history, and here it is. And so we tracked him down. Turns out he was a major donor to Rails to Trails Conservancy. And I had a 5-hour job interview with David Burwell, who was the founder of Rails to Trails Conservancy, at his mother's house in Woods Hole on Cape Cod, right next to what is called today the Shining Sea Trail. In a 5-hour job interview with one of the most high altitude visionary people in the world, they hired me as the point person to parachute into all the wars and to teach groups how to prevail or how to prevent the war in the first place. Because back in the 90s, these were a newfangled idea. And so for me to be hired by Rails to Trails Conservancy's David Burwell, who was the founder and the visionary guy because of what his mother went through back in the 70s to create the Shining Sea Trail, when there was no inkling of nobody knew how to do this stuff. There was no clearinghouse of information. There was no internet. There was nothing. And his mother got it built. And he was a lawyer for the National Wildlife Federation, hunters lobbyist organization. They were getting calls out of the Midwest. Come and help us. The farmers are obliterating where we hunt partridge and grouse. And he thought, oh my God, that's like my mother went through. And so he proposed to some big name conservation groups, national groups, to form a subset about teaching people how to create linear parks from dead railroads. And none of them were interested. So him and a friend, another lawyer named Peter Hardnick, formed Rails to Trails Conservancy as a clearinghouse of information how to do this, because it is the most complicated thing that your community can take on. It's not easy. And so for me to have a one-on-one 5-hour job interview with this guy who hired me, and actually I spoke at he died just a few years ago, and I was the speaker at the family event at the 5,000-foot shingle house overlooking Vineyard Sound. That's very memorable. This will change places. If we build out this network in southern New England, we'll be more like the Netherlands than the Netherlands is today. This didn't go to extraction industries anywhere here. This went to where the big mills were that created wealth in southern New England, and the gateway cities that have been disinvested in for many years now coming back to life. And the gateway towns along this corridor will be brought back to life as desirable places to live. This is very important to do. It's very important.
Very, very, very well said. I completely agree 100%. And I think a lot of I think a lot of people attended today because, Rails to Trails are very interested. Maybe something's happening in their own town. As I said, I conveyed my experience with what's happening in my town. And I'm just curious, do you have any, but also, like you said, your example was just, oh, this is just like what someone else went through. Can we, what lessons can we take from this and apply to maybe a slightly different situation? Do you have any, parting words or little words of wisdom for our, our attendees here, our local advocates who may be listening and, get some little spark of inspiration or, consolation for what they're possibly going through?
So I would just say that you probably should form a little group. You don't have to be a 501c3 off the bat, but form a group that's all about this project. I can point out if anybody's on here, I'm from Springfield, just take this with a grain of salt, that Springfield has a rail trail project 25 years in, they have not built an inch, not even 1 inch. And it's because projects of this sort get shelved downstream to be part of a neighborhood council. They become an agenda point on the neighborhood council. And the trail corridor here bisects the entire city and goes through like 6 neighborhoods. And so none of them want to take it on because it's just too small. And so you take the lesson to be learned that this is important. It's important to be its own group unto itself, not an agenda point for neighborhood council. Make it the important thing for your community at large and never give up. There will always be dead enders fighting you to their last breath. You don't have to win them over. You merely have to get to a plurality. Unless you're unfortunate enough to live in a Massachusetts town where you have to get 2/3 majority at town meeting. So that means nothing changes. Nothing changes for the good. Nothing changes for the bad. Cities are the way to go. Let's restore our cities.
Wonderful. Well, Craig, this has been, thank you so much for sharing your insight in this wonderful, the journey, 40+ year journey. It seems like we're at a great tipping point, and things are going to begin to accelerate. We can't wait to see what's coming down the pike. And, I look forward to talking with you offline more about ways that we can possibly work together. But thank you for it was very inspiring for, I think, our listeners today to hear what truly, what the impact, with something like you said, it seems small, but it really, really, really is big and can have a huge, huge impact on our communities and our state. So thank you for sharing, and thank you for offering to allow us to share your presentation again. And it was just wonderful to talk to you. And the reason we did this in May is the weather's finally nice here, at least in the southern part of the state. So get out, get on a rail trail. I would definitely be thinking that next time I'm out on the bike trail with my son. But thank you so very much for being with us today for this wonderful presentation. And I'll thank everybody, all of our attendees who were with us today and those who are watching on YouTube. Thank you for listening for Preservation Conversations. We're off for the summer, but we'll be back sometime in the fall. So Craig, once again, on behalf of Preservation Massachusetts, thank you so very much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.